The passing of King Arthur. Hail, King! Tomorrow thou shalt pass away. Farewell! There's an isle of rest for thee. Only when that's true does that ever go over well. But even, don't go around being a false prophet. You're going to die. And then someone says, oh, he said that person was going to die. It's... and then people are going to be like, well, he said this about a bunch of other people too. Great changes had taken place at King Arthur's court since the coming of Sir Galahad. The knights were all vowed now to search for the Holy Grail that had disappeared from the castle of King Pelles. When Sir Galahad went away, who had taken it, everybody asked, but no one could give a reply. Had it really been carried through the banqueting hall, the night that Sir Galahad had taken his place upon the seat perilous? Or was it only a dream, a vision that knights had seen? If it were a vision, would any of them see it again? Well, visions and dreams are just as real, but they're perhaps not as... they're real in a different sense. They could not answer these questions, but one and all they sought for the shining cup during the rest of their lives. Joseph and the rich fisher had long ago passed away, you see, and perhaps they alone knew what the Holy Grail really was. A stone, perhaps? The strange old minstrel, with the two bright snakes around his neck, knew just a little, but not everything. Well, you can certainly shape a stone into a cup. He wore the snakes to show that he belonged to the old order of bards, the men who were something like priests, and who sang stories of great nations and greater kings. Remember who's the ancient Persian sorcerer that the two snakes from the snake from each shoulder, and his song of the Holy Grail was written down. Ozzy Dahaka, yeah. His song of the Holy Grail was written down in the little book that he must have found in Merlin's mysterious house with the 70 windows and 60 doors. For Merlin was one of these bards himself, and very likely wore bright snakes about his neck as he came and went at King Arthur's court, though we are not exactly told that he ever did, but then we are by no means told that all that happened in those days, and if it were, perhaps we should not believe it. Well, there's a limit in conveying spiritual things, isn't there? This we do know, however, that all the knights who searched for the lost Grail cup knew that they had no chance of finding it, or even catching a glimpse of it in a vision, unless they were thoroughly good and true and pure and without reproach. So all of them tried hard to be so, and, though none of them ever quite succeeded, the very trying made their lives beautiful, just as shining and beautiful as the silver armor they wore, and the spears and swords that they carried in their hands. Now, before September 23rd, in the year 2000, I had scarcely any sort of spiritual experience, but my beliefs provoked me towards deeds. And if there were nothing spiritual whatsoever, no soul, no afterlife, whatever, certain beliefs are good in these material terms. They still met at the round table, still passed the cup of fellowship from hand to hand, but the king, as he sat among them, felt that he was growing old. His eyes were often heavy, and his feet and hands grew tired, when he donned his shining armor and wielded his famous sword, and one day he was obliged to go into battle against an enemy. When he was too weary to fight, he was struck down and wounded, and his faithful knights carried him to a quiet, grassy place in a meadow near which rippled the shining waters of a great lake. King Arthur lay on the moss, with his fingers on the handle of his sword Excalibur, and his followers stood around him with sad faces, for they thought that death was about to take their beloved king. And my stomach growls in anticipation. But he himself knew better. He smiled as he lay there, and his face was very bright. Lifting himself up a little, he looked towards the waters of the lake, and then he beckoned to a knight, who was called Sir Bedivere. "Take my sword Excalibur," said he. "Throw it as far as you can fling it toward the center of the lake, and then come back and tell me what happens." I'm trying to get that little plastic dragon to freeze in the middle of the little pool there. The bird feeding pool. But anyways, Sir Bedivere took the sword and carried it to the edge of the lake. Night was falling, and the moon was brightening above the quiet hills. In the moonlight, the jewels in the handle of Excalibur looked very rich and beautiful, so rich and so beautiful that Sir Bedivere felt he could not bear to throw the sword into the water. He hid it among the forget-me-nots and meadowsweet, and went, empty-handed, back to the king. "Did he throw the sword into the lake?" asked Arthur eagerly. "Yes, sire," answered Sir Bedivere boldly. "What happened?" "Nothing happened, sire." The king lay back again with a groan. "Faithless messenger," he said, "you have not thrown the sword. Go, do as I command you." Again Sir Bedivere went, but again the beauty of Excalibur overcame him. He returned to the king and declared that he had flung the sword into the water, but still nothing had happened. Arthur looked at him steadily, and his eyes made Sir Bedivere tremble. "You are not speaking the truth," cried the king. "Go and do as I command." His voice was very strong and stern. At last Bedivere obeyed. Hurrying to the water's edge, he took Excalibur in his hand again, this time not daring to look at its beauty. The rubies and sapphires and diamonds of the handle flashed as he flung it far, far into the lake. Just as it was about to strike the water, a white hand and arm, clothed in a shining sleeve, rose above the ripples, and the outstretched fingers caught the sword. 3 times the hand waved Excalibur in the moonlight. Then the arm and sword disappeared below the water, and all was still. Breathless and awed, Sir Bedivere went back to the king and told him what he had seen. "It is well," said Arthur wearily. "Carry me to the lake." And my stomach growls a 3rd time, yes. The outstretched fingers caught the sword, and the spirit of that sort of thing. Aleister Crowley's Thoth Tarot, the sword that says Thalema, the will on it, shining and stuff like this. I think that captures the whole spirit of this more than any. So his knights lifted him and carried him gently across the moonlit grass until they came to the water's edge. As they walked in slow procession, they saw a dim ship, like a dark barge, coming from the middle of the lake toward the bank. Many ladies, shadowy in pale light, were seated in it, with their heads bowed upon their hands. All of them were hooded, and 3 who wore crowns upon their heads looked like queens. Then the king bade the knights to lay him in the barge, and they did so, and gave him into the care of the 3 queens. So to the barge they came. There, though 3 queens put forth their hands and took the king and wept. Down from the hills swept a great wind, and it seemed as if the sound of sobbing and wailing was in its cold breath. The clouds rushed across the moon, and the water of the lake looked black and terrible as the barge began to move away from the land. The knights stood upon the bank and watched as if they were in a dream. Then, even as they watched, the darkness went away, far off. Far, right away, as it were, beyond the mere little shining islands, began to show, bright and beautiful. And for all the world, like sunset clouds. All the knights had heard of these islands, and knew that they were called the Isles of the Blessed. In the very center of them was one named Avalon, the fairest of them all. Perhaps this connects to the word Anun, which is sort of the realm of the fire beings or fieries or whatever you want to call them, the gendered unseen beings. Its valleys were fragrant with flowers, and in its orchard grew trees that bore golden apples. Remember that gift of the fairy card, in the Fiery Wicca Tarot, the apple bit? This can be related to that as far as this book's concerned. It seemed to the knights that the barge with the 3 fairy queens and the weary human king sailed right up to the shores of Avalon, and that a number of bright and beautiful people came to meet it. Then, from the dawn it seemed there came but faint, as from beyond the limit of the world, like the last echo bore of a great cry, sounds as if some fair city were one voice, around a king returning from his wars. Then the whole vision faded. Nothing was left but the lake and the moonlit meadows, and the memory of the great and only king of the Round Table. But some people say that Arthur lives and is happy in Avalon to this day, and that there he has met Joseph and the rich fisher, and his old wise teacher Merlin, the great magician. They say, too, that it is in Avalon that the silver table is hidden, on which stands the shining cup, and that there every evening is held the mysterious feast which fills all the guests with joy and amazement, just as they were filled with joy and amazement hundreds of years ago on that Christmas day when Joseph's staff broke into blossom at Glastonbury. And this year, the 26th, is the 5th of Yule. No. Saturday is the 22nd, the 21st, right? So Sunday, the 22nd, 23rd, 24th, 25th, 26th. Yeah, the 26th. But sometimes it's the 25th is the day that would be Mithra's day for those who observe that. But the darkest night of the year, which makes Hanukkah this year about as dark as it gets, because Hanukkah's starting Sunday night, but of the December. So Sunday the 22nd, but I mean in 2019. I'm recording these beforehand. But next, I'm pleased to present Ritual to Romance. So the Holy Grail thing is continued by tracing the story.